Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another workshop. We are live with Leo from Lightning Labs and Christoph from the Bitcoin design community. My name is Ed. I am one of the people working on Bolt Fun and helping run the Legends of the Lightning tournament. Welcome, Leo. Thank you very much for coming today to talk to us about Taro. Taro is a Taproot-powered protocol for issuing assets on Bitcoin. We're really excited to hear a lot about this one. We've had quite a few questions about it. A lot of people are interested in building and issuing assets for the Legends of Lightning hackathon. So yeah, how are you doing, Leo? Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm quite excited to talk about Taro. Good to see you again, Christoph. Good to meet you, Ed.
Of course. Well, it's always great to have you. Yeah, Christoph and I will drop backstage. We'll hand it over to you. And to anybody in the audience, if you have any questions to Leo to ask, feel free to just drop them in the comments. And once he's done with this presentation, we'll come back and we'll chat a little bit more and ask some of those questions and try and get them answered for you.
Yeah, drop your questions in the chat as you have them, and then I'll either address them right away if it fits, or we'll come to that later.
Cool, perfect.
Do I control the slides, or do you do that? I do that. I can. Wonderful. Yeah. Cool. So this is what I want to cover. I do want to separate this a bit into Taro on-chain and Taro off-chain. Partly because Taro on-chain, that's what you can currently play with. Taro on Lightning is still being fully spec'd out. It's still being implemented. Taro raises a couple of interesting new questions, both about the Lightning Network and about how we think of custody and how we think of just the limitations of the Bitcoin blockchain. And finally, I want to talk a bit about of why we believe this is so powerful and why we believe this is necessary, despite our Bitcoin only stance, and despite I personally live on Bitcoin. I use Bitcoin every day, and yet I'm still excited about Taro because I do think this is something that is useful to me and useful to others, and just helps us all connect through a global payment system. So before I show a bit about the magic that makes Taro work, I want to just look at the concept of how a Taro transaction works, because we can imagine a Taro transaction as to be just a simple Bitcoin transaction, simple Bitcoin transaction that has some extra data added to it. You might be familiar with these ideas of colored coins. They've been around since the early day of Bitcoin. In a way, ordinals are also a type of colored coin. The first stablecoins that were issued on Bitcoin were issued on colored coin protocols, and they worked relatively simply. You make a Bitcoin transaction and you attach data to that Bitcoin transaction, usually through OP return, and that data that you attach kind of now defines it. It kind of defines, here I create a million tether. And now you need additional software. You need to look at every single Bitcoin transaction that happens. And you need to look at that and see, has this transaction, does this transaction relate to this layer now on top, for example, the stable coin, and then again, does it relate to me? So it works. It doesn't scale very well because you need to add a lot more data to every transaction, and it requires you to keep track of every single transaction there is. So it's not very light client friendly. If you have a mobile wallet, then a traditional stablecoin on a colored coin simply doesn't work unless you have some kind of third party that looks at every single block and every single transaction. So what Taro does here is that it keeps this data off the chain, and instead this data is just committed to. So committed to in a cryptographic sense means we create a piece of data. We are adding, I'll talk a bit later about how this tweaking of the pub key works. We're kind of tweaking a Taproot public key, meaning that once we make the transaction and once we have put the transaction into the blockchain, once we got that confirmed, we can later prove that we attached this data and no other data, in a similar way that you can use a hash to commit to a message. So you can create a message, you can keep that message secret, and you can publish the hash, and later everybody will know that this hash related to this message that you published and that you created, and no other message. One big difference between a Taro on-chain transaction and a Bitcoin transaction is that the verification is not done by the Bitcoin miner. When you make a Bitcoin transaction, you kind of reveal to the network which Bitcoin you are spending, and you publish a signature, and the miners will kind of pick your transaction and put it into a block. And now the entire network is confirmed that this transaction is valid, so that it really only spends Bitcoin that you own and that it doesn't create Bitcoin out of nowhere. But in Taro, this verification is done by the recipient. So when somebody sends you Taro assets, the transaction might confirm in the blockchain, but the transaction might be invalid. And now your wallet, your client, has to verify that this transaction is, that, for example, you didn't create illegitimately Taro assets out of nowhere, or that you really owned the Taro assets that you transacted. And for this, you need proofs. We'll also go a bit into what these proofs look like and what kind of data is included in these proofs. But a proof in a very simple form is proofs that you didn't create new assets, that you really did transfer the assets to a new Taro address, and that you attach the proper signatures. The one thing that we still need Bitcoin in this case for is to resolve double spends. And that's also a bit of where I think the efficiency comes from, is that a lot of the overhead that Taro creates is kept outside of Bitcoin. And the only thing that Bitcoin is still handling, that miners are still resolving, is to make sure you don't spend to a Taro twice, because you, with all these proofs, with all these signatures, you might still run into a situation where I send a transaction to Christopher and I send a transaction to Ed, and of course they're both valid, they both have signatures, they both have the correct witness data, but only one of them can confirm, and that's what we need the Bitcoin blockchain for. Now, if every Bitcoin transaction is a Taro transaction, or if every Taro transaction is a Bitcoin transaction, then how does it scale? Because then in the very basics, right, you would still have that block size limit. One important consideration is definitely that you can have multiple assets inside a Bitcoin transaction. So it kind of puts forward this idea: what if you only have one UTXO that you own? You might have some extra UTXO in Lightning channel, but every time you want to transact Bitcoin or open a channel or send Taro asset, you only have that one UTXO, and that's a relatively efficient way of handling this data. I'll also talk a bit later about then how do we put these into Lightning channels. But first, I want to explain how these proofs work. So I hope you can see a bit what's on the right. It's not so important to look at every single detail. What is important is to consider what is it that we need to show in this case. So every time I transact a Taro asset, I need to prove to you that this Taro asset is included in this big tree. So I need to prove to you, you now own one Leo coin. So for that, we can use Merkle trees. Merkle trees are a very efficient tool for proving something is included in a tiny piece of data. So we can use the a single hash, right? A single SHA-256 hash that's relatively short, that fits into the blockchain, and that can now prove that a lot of data is included in this root, simply by the way Merkle trees work. So you can have multiple accounts and multiple assets and multiple pieces of information, and they all hash together into that one root. So that's something that Bitcoin uses to prove that a certain transaction was included in a block. So every block also has a Merkle tree root that kind of, without doubt, then shows whether a transaction is included in there or not. For something like Taro, we also need to prove that a piece of data is not in a Merkle tree. And that's something that is relatively difficult, because if we have a Merkle tree and it has millions of pieces of data in it, how do we really show in an efficient way that something is not included? If we were to release the entire Merkle tree, then you would have to look at every single item. Let's say there's 1 million items in there, and you have to look at every single item and calculate over the entire space to see, is the item that I'm looking for not in there? And that's very inefficient. That's also not very private. That would require you to publish and transact these huge pieces of data. So what we use instead is called a sparse Merkle tree. And a sparse Merkle tree, at the face of it, sounds like a very difficult to handle beast. A sparse Merkle tree is a Merkle tree that by default includes every conceivable object. Meaning if you have a sparse Merkle tree over the SHA-256 space, then every single hash is included in that Merkle tree in the exact order, from left to right, from 00001 to 11111, right, in binary form. And that is only works because by default, all of these hashes will be empty. So we kind of know in advance what they look like. And we know at every node of the Merkle tree what the empty leaves look like, and how the empty leaves hash into an empty node, and so on. So we kind of can construct this sparse Merkle tree as it's empty. We don't need to go through 2 to the power of 256 hashes. We only need to go to 256 hashes. For every node, we need to make 1 hash, and we can compute our empty Merkle tree. And now we can insert items into that Merkle tree kind of selectively, because that Merkle tree, as we go like 0, 1, for every hash, right? If every hash in binary form is 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0 something, now we can look for this hash by going down the Merkle tree in exactly that path. So if the hash starts at 0, then we go left first. If the hash then continues with 1, we go right first. So that way you have a way of proving that a piece of data is not included in the Merkle tree by only looking at where the piece of data is supposed to be. So in practice, I will give you a piece of data, or you will generate that piece of data yourself, and you will hash it, and you will then know, okay, so if I want to see if this data is included or not, I need to look there. Sometimes in the Bitcoin private keys, we use the analogy of a universe in which there are trillions and trillions of lockers, and we kind of hide our private key in one of these lockers, and though we know how to find that private key purely by knowing where the locker is. That's kind of how we hide our Bitcoin mathematically, and there's so many lockers that nobody's able to check all of them. That's what protects our Bitcoin, that's what protects our cryptographic secrets. And in this case, we are kind of revealing the location of the locker, and we're letting you look inside if there's something there or not. And that is relatively efficient, because now we don't need to publish the entire sparse Merkle tree, but we only need to tell you the path, and then you can see yourself where that item is, and if it's there, then I did not prove exclusion, and rather if it's empty, then you know the item was. Then I have proven in the Taro case that, for example, an account is now empty. And that's important if we want to, for example, make sure that I didn't spend a Leo coin twice. The next thing we want to prove with this tree is that we want to prove that I didn't create new coins out of nowhere. So of course, if I have a token and I want to send it to you, then I need to prove that I no longer have that token. But I also want to prove that I didn't create just a second token out of nowhere. And for this, we use a Merkle sum tree. A Merkle sum tree is relatively easy to understand in that every node contains the total amount of the assets that are in that node. And as we kind of hash up the tree, we don't just hash up the tree, but we add to the hash kind of in human readable form how many assets are in that tree. So at the very top, the root will now contain the cryptographic root of the Merkle tree, but also the total amount of assets that exist inside of that tree. So everybody who looks at the root immediately knows how many assets there are in all of it. And as you go down the nodes, you can kind of see your own, you can kind of find your own leaf of the Merkle tree, and with that you find your own balance. And so you can, if you compare two Merkle trees, then you can see the first Merkle tree has the same total number of assets as the second Merkle tree. That proves you that there's no non-inflation. The second thing you want to then look at is that your item is now included. So you're looking for your account, and you make sure, okay, the Bitcoin that I think, or the Leo coin that I think I own, are indeed where I want them to be. And you look at this exclusion in that where they used to be, they're supposed to be there no longer. And so that's what happens as we kind of transact these proofs, is that let's first think of the first situation, we mint an asset. We can also look a bit into the Taproot transaction, but as we mint an asset, we are creating a tree, and we are creating that tree relatively simply in that we just award ourselves with, let's say, 1 million Leo coin. I'm minting Leo coin. I'm creating this for me, and that means I create a tree that awards my account with 1 million coins. So now I'm creating the empty sparse Merkle tree, or I have that ready already because it's the same all the time. And I insert one piece of information, that is, my account now owns 1 million Leo coin. I will hash it back until the root hash is fixed and that contains the information that 1 million Leo coin exists in total. There is also, if you look at the top right, it's a bit beige in color. That allows us. This is a separate Merkle tree that allows us to contain multiple Taro assets inside of a single transaction. So we could theoretically, I can theoretically create 1 million Leo coin and 1,000 Leo coins again in a different transaction. A better example would be I create a million Leo coins and I create 1,000 beef bucks, which is roast beef's private coin. So I will now create 2 of these Merkle trees, and I will put them in their respective spot, so that there's kind of a Taro root hash, which gives the information of which different assets exist in a single tree. And if you look at the very top, the blue part, that's the Taproot transaction. So a Taproot transaction mainly, or a Taproot address mainly differs from a conventional Bitcoin address, in that a conventional Bitcoin address is a hash of a public key, and the Taproot key is a public key. So it's a bit going back to the roots of Bitcoin, when we were sending coins directly to each other, public keys, rather than to hashes of scripts or hashes of public keys. And one thing this allows us to do is that we can manipulate public keys. For example, we can use them for, we can aggregate them for multi-signature. And in this case, what we do is we take so you create a private key. That private key then maps to a public key, and you can add the root of all our trees to that public key in a way that you can later prove through a signature or through a transaction that A, you owned that output, and B, you owned the B, you really did add this piece of information. So once you create the tree, and we make a Bitcoin transaction to that tree, and that's how we create our assets. So once this, everybody can then look up this address on the Bitcoin blockchain, and everybody can, who has the proof, we can publish that proof, or we can give that proof to somebody peer-to-peer. They are now, they can now be sure that this is really the data that was committed to the blockchain, and they can watch the UTXO to see if it's spent or unspent. The one interesting new question that this raises is that now you have two kind of levels of custody. You have the Taro asset ownership, and you have the Taproot asset ownership, and they are they kind of belong together in a way, because now to send a Taro transaction, you need to make two signatures. You need to prove ownership of two private keys. One is the key that is associated with the Taproot account, and the other is the key that is associated with your Taro account, meaning that if you want to, so you can create a new Merkle tree that reflects the change of balances from me, for example, to Christopher. And to make this valid, I also need to sign this transfer. But in order to publish this transfer, I need to make a Bitcoin transaction. And this Bitcoin transaction can only be made if I have the private key to the Taproot output. In the way that Taro works today, you pretty much only have the option of like the full self-custody. So every Taro transaction you make is a Bitcoin on-chain transaction. So it looks relatively similar on the blockchain. If I want to send you some of my Leo coin, then we're going to split. So I'm going to spend an output, the output of the minting transaction, and I'm going to split that into two outputs. One goes to myself as a change, and the other one goes to the recipient. And that then means that both the sender and the recipients have, here in the top left is a full self-custody, meaning they own both the Taproot UTXO and the Taro asset keys. But it is also possible that you hold your Taro keys, but you do not hold the Taproot keys. So this is what this is kind of the first, the first thing that's very different from how Bitcoin works, is that you have this semi-custodial relationship in which so we call this a pocket universe, and pocket universes are incredibly efficient because if somebody operates a pocket universe, that pocket universe can exist over 1 million different assets, and each asset can have 1 billion different account holders. And every time somebody wants to transact with their assets, they can, kind of create their signature, show their intent, send this transaction to the operator of the pocket universe, and the pocket universe can now aggregate all these transactions and maybe say every block or every hour or every day, publish a single on-chain transaction that reflects billions and billions of transfers. And in that relationship, the pocket universe is still not able to steal people's assets, but it is able to censor people's assets because it can't just refuse to include certain changes. So there is it's somewhat of a custodial relationship as far as the transaction goes, not as far as the ownership goes. There's also the opposite case, right? So the user who would be operating a Pocket Universe kind of doesn't need to have any Taro assets. They don't need to own anything in that tree. They only hold the Taproot UTXO. Very curious how that's going to develop, whether people want that. For example, if you have certain types of existing custodial relationships, such as an exchange, they might be significantly improved if you introduce something like this Pocket Universe concept, because then at least inside of the exchange, where we already accept that assets are kind of transacted custodially, at least we have a very solid record of ownership and a very a solid auditing trail. If you think back at these sparse Merkle trees and these Merkle sum trees, then one way they're used today is improving reserves. So I think BitMEX is using this, maybe some others too, in that they're publishing these Merkle sum trees in which every account is recorded, and the total sum of all accounts now sum up to the total assets under management. If you do have questions, I'm going to now move over to the Taro on Lightning. But I understand if there's some questions on how this works on chain or what kind of limitations it brings, now would be a good time to. So because they work similarly to Bitcoin, we can do similar stuff with them. We can deposit them into Lightning channels, for example, and we can also transact them with HTLCs, or if we move over to a more Taproot-powered Lightning network, to PTLCs, because we can spend them in a similar fashion as a Bitcoin does. So we can also settle disputes in a similar way as a Bitcoin does, without requiring the Bitcoin miners to know what's inside of the Merkle trees. All we need to do is have an efficient way of kind of exchanging all these proofs among each other, because of course, if we're dealing with frequent channel state changes, and we're dealing with forced closures now, and then we have tons and tons of Merkle trees that need to be stored somewhere, and that need to be, in the event of a non-cooperative close, need to be kind of revealed to the recipients, not to the broader network. I think one of the big promises of Lightning is that it is one big promise of Taro and Lightning is that it is interoperable with the general Lightning invoice, in that you issuing a Taro invoice, it doesn't really differ in specs from issuing a regular Lightning invoice, meaning that the payer is really unable to tell whether you want to receive a stable coin, or whether you want to receive Leo coin, or whether you want to receive Bitcoin. And that allows you to now plug in your stablecoin to the broader Lightning network and kind of benefit from the existing network effect that exists, and benefit from the existing kind of community and also from the ecosystem of wallets and exchanges, Lightning service providers. So you don't need to start a new network to get your token running, because we understand creating a new Lightning network for every single asset would be a very, very difficult task, and probably only one or two stablecoins would be able to do so. And even if they succeed, they probably are very centralized, much more centralized than the Lightning network is, that kind of benefits from a large community of node runners that might not be willing to run these nodes on some stablecoin network. The example that I show here below, you might have seen this before. it demonstrates how Alice, who has called a Lightning USD balance. So in this case, some kind of stable coin issued on Taro inside of that channel. So now she wants to pay Zane, and Zane is on the far other side of the network. They have never interacted with each other. They barely know each other. Now, normally a Bitcoin payment would get routed through the network to Zane. And in this case, Alice wants to spend her USD balance because Alice is afraid of the Bitcoin rapidly depreciating after she gets paid. So she rather keeps a USD balance, depreciates much more predictably. Now, she has these Taro assets in a channel, in this case with Bob, and that she probably opened that channel with Bob because she knows Bob is a reliable peer who is willing to swap USD to BTC on demand. So there's lots of ways this might look like. In a way, Alice and Bob kind of have to agree on an exchange rate. If they do not agree, then Alice has no other choice than to close the channel and open a channel with a new broker who offers a more favorable exchange rate. But Bob, of course, also wants to. So there is some competition in there, but it's very similar to how routing works today in the Lightning Network, in that Alice has to kind of agree to Bob's routing fee, and in this case, the routing fee you can think of that routing fee as an exchange rate. You can think of that routing fee as a percentual change still. Now, and Bob takes these USD on his incoming channel, and he passes on Satoshis on his outgoing channel. And these Satoshis get routed through the Lightning Network as they would normally. This example only looks at Alice as a payer of a stable coin, and Zane in this case accepts Bitcoin. But the example could also look the other way around. There could also be Alice and Zane both using their stablecoin. They could also use different stablecoins. Alice could use Circle USD and Zane could use Tether USD. They could use completely different currencies. I think it is very much a strength of this that it doesn't really matter what kind of conversions you're doing. Of course, if you transact with two different stablecoins through the Bitcoin network, you do have two currency conversions. But I do believe these currency conversions can be incredibly cheap, partly because they are non-custodial in nature. They are routed in a similar way as HTLCs, and partly because these exchange rates can be quoted on relatively short intervals. So Zane, in this case, creates a Lightning invoice, presents this to Alice, and Alice wallet can ping Bob pretty much every second. They can agree on a new exchange rate every second, and Alice kind of sees the live updates of how much she's willing to pay. So these spreads can be very, very thin from a market perspective. And similarly, if Zane is the one receiving and he wants to receive a stable coin, then in this case, Yana would kind of add, we call them edge nodes, would kind of act as an edge node for Zane. And Yana could say, I can give you this quote, I can guarantee this exchange rate for 15 minutes, and Zane kind of limit these invoices in duration. Of course, the longer a invoice is valid, the larger the spread is probably going to be. But in this case, the dynamics are still pretty much the same as with a regular Lightning routing. And that Zane has to be willing to has to be aware that if he has a peer that picks relatively high fees, that nobody will want to transact with them. And similarly, Alice is incentivized to find a peer who offers small fees. And of course, there is a similar element as in the Lightning Network that you can at all times kind of end your relationship with your peer. You can take your Taro assets and your Bitcoin back to chain cooperatively or non-cooperatively, and find a new peer for your transactions. So why do we believe this is relevant, or why do we believe this is exciting? Partly because there is very significant market demand. There are a lot of users, a lot of people, a lot of companies. They all, you might have heard their talks, you might have heard their complaints. They do say that's what we want, that's what other people want, that's what our customers want. People love transacting with Bitcoin over Lightning, but they still want to hold. Other kind of assets, mostly US dollar, but in many other cases also their local fiat currencies. We might also see in the future all other forms of stable coins. They might be pegged to commodities directly, right? If you want to, if you know in advance you have to buy, fill up your truck with gas, then buying some kind of token that represents a liter of gas in advance might be attractive. This also massively improves how kind of the market for wallets work and the market for brokers. Currently, if you want to, for example, if you look at Strike, they have a popular platform where you can connect your bank account and you can now pay any Lightning invoice that you're being presented with, and you're being debited a US dollar amount from your bank account. And that's a relatively similar experience that that Taro is theoretically able to guarantee, with the difference that now you no longer are limited to a single wallet. You're no longer limited to a single broker. You're no longer limited to a single stable coin that backs the whole thing. But there can be competition between all these different aspects. So if you, and that considerably lowers the barrier to entry as a wallet developer, as a stablecoin developer, as a broker, because these functions can all be entirely different. So we like to explain this example of what a community bank might look like. If you think of some of the successful Bitcoin community banks, for example, Bitcoin Beach comes to mind. They have created lots of buzz, created a very sustainable local community with lots of international imitators. And now for them to function, they need to develop their own wallet. They need to develop, if they want to offer something like stable sats or stable channels, they need to create their own relationship with an exchange. And we believe in the future, all a community bank should have to do is kind of maybe they're limited to simply distributing an existing stablecoin, or they're just limited to issuing their own stablecoin, but that their users, their community bank users, would be able to pick from a variety of wallets and pick from a variety of maybe edge node operators. And that leads to a lot more competition. That leads to a lot more innovation. That leads to a much better user experience. The fact that this is demanded so frequently also shows how much capital there is ready on the sidelines to enter the Lightning Network, both as BTC in forms of routing capital and in the form of investment money, ready for entrepreneurs to be picked up who want to improve the user experience and improve kind of access to a truly global financial system. And hopefully Taro can also bring, hopefully Taro can be one of the catalysts that bring this capital, this human capital, this money, these Bitcoin into the Lightning Network. I do have some further reading here, in that the first is the Builder's Guide that explains first the protocol and second the tool. I do very much encourage you to not miss the second half of the session led by Hannah Rosenberg, in which she is going to run you through the actual client that is now released as alpha. I've also linked here the BIPs, which are very interesting for those on a very technical level, and a Q&A with Ryan Gentry, who is very very easily digestible and interesting overview. We do have time for questions too. If you have questions in the comments. See, I was here in the private chat and didn't see any of your comments.
Hey, no worries. Let me I'll put some of these questions up for you now. That was awesome, by the way. A lot to do with universes. There's quite a lot to unpack there.
Yes,
it is quite a complex topic, but
let me quickly spend 5 minutes on universes. Partly, universes aren't necessarily required by the protocol, right? This all works today without universes, but universes are probably an important tool to improve the user experience, and to make everything very smooth. Now, how exactly universes develop is then also largely like a business question. It's a question for the those that mint the assets. It's a question for those who run the universes. In a similar way that a Lightning Network Explorer or a blockchain explorer is theoretically not necessary for the function of the Lightning Network or the Bitcoin blockchain, but we do like to use them, and there's been some really great improvements out there. What a universe will see depends on what we tell the universe, and that probably depends on our clients. What will they tell the universe by default? Will these universes, will I choose a universe? Universes could be theoretically community run. You could volunteer your proofs to the universe. You could also prefer to keep them for yourself. The universe could also be kind of run by the issuer, who keeps track of a lot of these transactions. A universe, the example that I used for universe is the Pocket universe, which of course generates, needs the data from its users and the signatures and everything to function. But whether it then publicizes that information is also up to that universe. So universes don't really define transaction or exchange rates. Exchange rates are only relevant between the edge node and the, so if we look at the edge node on the slide here, then in this case, Bob is an edge node, and Bob needs to now agree with Alice on a exchange rate. And now, so there isn't really any oracle. The protocol never at no point kind of dictates exchange rate. That's up for markets to come up with. Exactly how Bob and Alice agree on the exchange rate also then depends on implementations and depends on how the market evolves. I believe it's most likely that Bob will kind of publish his exchange rates on a maybe 5 second, 1 second, 15-second basis in a similar way that he would update his routing fees on a private node. But he might advertise these publicly to kind of solicit people to peer with Bob, because Bob is still going to take a fee. He still wants to have as much volume routed through his node as possible. Bob might also, depending on how much he routes, he might want to hedge against price movements, because if every time Bob takes in USD on one side, he's essentially selling BTC in this case. He's buying the BTC from Alice and he's selling them to the broader network, in this case, his peers. So for that, he might want to hedge. So Bob might again be connected to another edge node, which acts in as a hedge, and that's all relatively difficult to predict, because this is because markets are going to evolve around this. All we can do is, how do markets work today? For example, a payment processor functions relatively similar to an edge node. A payment processor throws up a payment processor is prompted with a fiat price. Let's say I buy something for $10. Then the payment processor will throw up a Lightning invoice with a fixed Satoshi amount. That might be valid depending on configuration for a minute, for 5 minutes, for an hour. And the payment processor has to then hedge against the possibility of, in this case, the price going down a lot while my invoice is still valid. So in this case, so how exactly will Alice, how do I go to Mashani's question? How does Alice need to open a channel with Bob to convert the USD to sats? Yes, Alice will need this channel with Bob. How exactly she obtains that channel is also not very well defined. I believe it will also look very similar to how it looks today in the Lightning Network, in that Alice will probably download a wallet from the internet, and that wallet will create a channel with some kind of liquidity provider the first time she receives Satoshis. And that is also, I think, a point that is worth to mention, because it can potentially be very efficient. I do believe that capital costs in Bitcoin are relatively high. It's relatively expensive to buy Bitcoin and deploy them on the Lightning Network. There's no credit. I can't easily go around and borrow Bitcoin. For something like a stablecoin, it will probably be very cheap to borrow stablecoins, simply because of the nature of how easy these things can be created. So if I now download a Taro-friendly Lightning wallet, and the first time I receive a transaction, I might emit with a single on-chain UTXO, I might already have four channels, and that one channel is over Bitcoin. That might be relatively small unless I'm willing to pay a higher fee to get a lot of Bitcoin inbound liquidity, and the other channels might just be relatively large, of the most popular stablecoin channels, and that means that after the first transaction, you are able to receive a certain amount of USD and euros and maybe yen. Now, you can then fill up these accounts with, ideally by receiving payments. Ideally, you're issuing people invoices. You kind of save up in that channel, and then you spend it out. So if Alice and Bob don't get along, for example, if Bob increases his prices, then Alice would have to close these channels and open a new channel with another peer. Saunter is asking about Taro BTC channels. So ideally, if you want to continue using Bitcoin and you want to receive payments in sats and you want to spend sats, ideally, you shouldn't have to upgrade at all. Ideally, your client, as it works today, is going to be interoperable with these invoices generated by Taro clients. You should only really need a Taro-aware client if you want to hold Taro assets. Now, of course, there is because it is relatively cheap at the margin to add stablecoins to a channel, because you don't need to pay any extra on-chain fees, and because I assume the capital costs of a Taro asset are relatively low, then maybe by default a lot of future Lightning wallets will be something like Taro enabled, because if you want to accept Bitcoin, that's great. Everything needs to be set up for Bitcoin anyway. And if you want to now be enabled to accept other stablecoins, there's zero cost. So depending on how easy it is to implement and how widespread these tokens are and how well liquidity goes for these tokens, maybe every BTC channel will then also be a Taro channel. So if you open a channel, so we like to, from a Bitcoin blockchain perspective, there's one channel, there's one UTXO. From a Lightning wallet perspective, every asset inside of that UTXO is kind of its own channel. So if you have a channel of, in this case, LUSD, then that implies that you also at the very least have another channel over sats, even though that channel might be ridiculously small. It might be unroutable. It might only exist to kind of anchor the UTXO on the blockchain. But you will need kind of, if you want to then later add the ability, let's say you have LUSD and you only have LUSD and BTC, and you want to now also gain the ability to receive L Euro or L Yen, then you will need another channel, and that will require a new on-chain transaction. So once the channel is opened, or once any kind of transaction has been made on-chain, then there's no way to add a new asset or change a balance. But we don't know exactly how this is going to develop, but I can easily imagine that you might simply by default put, as a liquidity provider who is able to borrow millions of stable coins almost for free from the issuer directly, they might simply see it as so low in marginal cost that every UTXO they create has the top 5 or top 10 stable coins already enabled and or already committed into that channel, and all you need to then do on the wallet side is to enable them and instruct the wallet to say, I want to get paid in this stable coin rather than the other, or I want to swap between these two stable coins. Who else has questions? Or which questions have I not? Yes. That is a great and difficult question. So I hope you don't need to read everything on this. I hope you can kind of tell that this is made up of 3 Merkle trees. The one Merkle tree is the blue one at the top left. That's the Taproot Merkle tree. So the Taproot Merkle tree usually would define spending conditions. So it's kind of like an if statements. You can say, I want to spend this transaction either under spending condition 1, which means a single transaction from a single signature from this key, or spending condition 2, which is 2 signatures from these other 2 keys. And Taproot allows for an almost infinite amount of these spending conditions. But what Taproot also allows us to do is it allows us to just take any random data that Taproot doesn't even understand and put them into a leaf of that tree. And that's what we are using here. We're using this feature in Taproot that allows us to just add arbitrary data to commit to that data. And the data that we're committing to is first this yellow Taro tree. And that's the Taro tree that kind of lists which assets exist in this transaction. So maybe by default it's 1, maybe sometimes it's 2 or 3. It could theoretically be almost infinitely large. And each of these Taro trees, each of these Taro leaves represents an individual asset. And each of these assets will have its own tree again. And that's the green tree. So now if we want to verify, then first we have the minting transaction. Now I'm minting an asset, I'm minting 1 million Leo coin, and I am generating this tree. I am first generating the green tree, in which I award myself 1 million coins out of nothing. So no signature, just contains the data that this is kind of minted. I then take the root of that asset and create the yellow tree. I take the root of that asset and create the blue tree, and then I make the on-chain Bitcoin transaction. Now, for you to receive a Taro asset, you will need to give me a Taro address. A Taro address contains all the information necessary for me to create a new Merkle tree that corresponds to you owning one of my Leo coin. So it probably needs the public key, most importantly. It also, Taro addresses also contain information that make it easy for me to know what kind of asset are you actually receiving. So there's always the risk that you want Leo coin, but you actually meant the other Leo, right? And so we identify assets by their minting transaction. So I will kind of first have to tell you what is the key to my minting transaction, or you will have to obtain that maybe through a universe. Maybe the universe says, oh, Leo coin, it's always this guy's coin and never that other guy's coin. So you kind of trust that that universe then with giving you the right Leo coin identifier. And once I have your Taro address, I can create, in this case, I will create, in the standard case, I will create 2 new tree sets. And one tree set is again for myself, in which which reflects the new balance of my Leo coin, right? So 21 million, I send you 1 million Leo coin, I send you 100,000. So now I have 900,000 Leo coin for myself. So I will create a tree that reflects that. I will then create a tree that awards you with 100,000 Leo coin, and the first tree, the one for myself, is spent in a new output to a Taproot address that I control, and the second one is spent to a Taproot output that you control. And for you now to verify that you really received these assets, you need to check that Taproot output on the Bitcoin blockchain. You no longer need to, so very different from the previous Colorcoin proposals, you no longer need to look at every single transaction in the Bitcoin blockchain and check if your transaction's in there. You only need to check a single output. You only need to, you expect it to arrive at a certain point, and you only need to check that. So now that you kind of suspect that this transfer has been made, you now need to ask me for the information, for the proof information. That is mainly that big Merkle tree. So I will hand you that big Merkle tree, and I will also hand you the signature that is needed to kind of prove that I really was authorized to make this transaction. And now if you want to pass this asset on, if you now want to send 10,000 of your 100,000 Leo coin to somebody else, you will again go through the same procedure. And as you transfer the proofs to the new recipient, you will also include the proofs that I gave you. So the longer you transact Taro assets on chain, the longer this kind of proof becomes. So it grows linearly, which should be quite easy to handle. But every time you transact, you have a new proof file. So it kind of, you could think of this as like a virtual Taro. Every asset kind of has a virtual Taro blockchain that goes all the way back to the minting transaction, which is also why it's called the Genesis transaction. So the follow-up question was whether the entire tree is used in the verification process. And no, you don't have to reveal the entire tree. So for example, you don't have to reveal what in this slide is called the branch hash AB. You also don't have to reveal the balances of all the users. You only have to reveal the path that proves to you that your balance is now included, and maybe if and also the path to me to prove that the assets have kind of left my account. But if there are any other assets in there or any other accounts in there that are unaffected by our transaction, then we don't need to reveal them. This is Saunter has another great liquidity question. So I personally believe, so at the moment we have two large stablecoins, and they're pretty much impossible to contest. Even Circle has difficulty like penetrating Tether's market share, and that is because these stablecoins have significant network effects. Now, if I want to buy a stablecoin, then I rely on like a huge network effect to kind of find a broker that sells me that stablecoin, to find an exchange that lists it. If I want to pay somebody in a stablecoin, then we both need to agree on which stablecoin we use. So we kind of will always gravitate towards the largest one. And that, I think Taro actually breaks this. So Taro makes it a lot easier for you to run your own stablecoin. Because hypothetically now, you can issue your own stablecoin and you can distribute that stablecoin in your community. And you might be better at this than Tether because the stablecoin is backed by you and you are known in your community. But in the current model, right, why you wouldn't succeed in this is because people are still not going to find a wallet to hold your stablecoin. People are still not going to find anybody who they want to pay, right? Probably if they want to pay people inside of your community, they can already do that. There's probably millions of ways to do that. What they have difficulty with is paying people outside of their community and making online payments and making cross-border payments. And for that, they need to find a stablecoin that the other side exists too. But with Taro, all they need is to take the stablecoin that you issued and deposit that into a Lightning channel with an edge node that is willing to exchange that stablecoin. So that might also be somebody in your community who is simply, well, it might be you, who is willing to exchange that stablecoin to Bitcoin. And now, even though they have a stablecoin that only a few hundred people are using, they can transact with the entire Lightning network. And on the other side of the Lightning network, there might be somebody who has another community stablecoin with only a few hundred people, and they're able to receive payments in that. Despite you not agreeing on the same stablecoin, you are now able to transact directly with each other. I think that is quite potentially quite a powerful market dynamic. Thanks for linking the Taro guide. Who else has a question? Great, happy to hear you're bullish on Taro. Yeah, I do encourage you to check out Hannah's talk because the client is, I wouldn't say it's production ready, but it's definitely at the point where it's fun to play with, where transactions work. So don't miss that. I think it's on Thursday. Maybe Ed can help us.
Friday at 3 p.m. UTC. Yeah.
Yeah. So you get the demo day.
We'll also be live on Thursday in Twitter Spaces. I think it's 4 p.m. UTC for a sort of another tokens on Bitcoin, which will maybe be slightly more of a higher level chat. We went into obviously we did some deep dive into slightly more technical areas of Merkle trees and universes and things like that. I know Bitcoin and I, Christoph and I, had a few slightly sort of high level questions. Obviously, as designers who are looking to take part in either the Bitcoin Design-a-thon or the Legends of Lightning tournament, some people kind of want to know how they can be using Taro in the next month or two. What is the current state of Taro now? Like what is usable now versus what you kind of see Taro being in a couple of years' time?
The current state is that there is an alpha client that you can run on SimNet, Direct Test, Testnet, on which you can mint assets and you can send them on chain, and you can kind of transact the proofs. You might still run into a bug or two, especially if you handle edge cases. But it is rapidly developing. If you look at the GitHub repository, I'm always quite amazed every day I look up, every day I do a git pull and there's new code, and it always fixes something. Within a year, I very much expect that this is production ready. I also expect that there will be the first kind of Taro channels. I don't know if a year is enough to already bring this into consumer wallets, but yeah, it's always easy to underestimate how much can be done in a year or two, and that's always easy to overestimate how much can be done in a month. But I mean, this was announced in April, I think, for the first time. So it took almost half a year until a usable alpha client came out. But that's the heavy lifting is what you see here in the slide, is to construct all these Merkle trees in a reproducible way.
Absolutely. Christoph, have you got any questions there for Leah?
Oh man, thanks for the overview. I have endless questions here. It's super fascinating. It was a great overview. The thing that stood out to me most is that the Taro channels are fixed to specific assets. That seems to be a very particular property that seems to have a lot of second layer effects, repercussions, or whatnot. It seems like if let's say in the future, I will use this, I'll set up my wallet, and maybe in there at the beginning, during onboarding, it will ask me like which currencies do you want to accept or work with? Like what's your day-to-day? And maybe if I'm in Europe, I'll pick euro. Maybe I travel a lot to the US, then I'll pick euro and dollar. So, and then I'll be and maybe there's another question that says, well, how much liquidity you typically need? And then ideally, the Lightning service provider potentially also sets me up with that liquidity. And then I'm kind of set for a long time, and I don't really need to. So there's something I can imagine. It probably also means that like non-fungible tokens or really small kind of fun tokens, if I create my Christoph banana token or so, it would be incredibly difficult to get that out to anyone. Because I mean, I'll probably end up with all of them, right? Because everyone will swap them back to me, and no one else is going to open up Christoph banana token Taro channels, right?
Yeah. So hypothetically, why wouldn't you be able to commit an NFT into a Lightning channel? And I think, like, hypothetically, you would be able to. What NFTs lack is a good pricing mechanism. And for you to be able to pay with that NFT, you need that pricing mechanism. And so maybe you can think of an NFT as a concert ticket. Then the price could be set, but you're not really, it's not really meaningful anymore. It's only meaningful if somebody can issue you an invoice and you say, I'm willing to now pay $10 to fulfill this Satoshi invoice, because that's really what's happening behind the scene. How do you surface this to now users? How do you surface all these costs to users? I think that was the core of your question, and I think that is a relatively solvable question. It's more of an interface, an experience question rather than a technical question. I think this is not exactly well solved today already. If I get started with Breeze or Phoenix, then I kind of have to accept the defaults, and the defaults are I have a minimum amount that needs to be paid to me, and I will only get a channel over the size of my minimum amount of the size of my incoming payment plus maybe 10% or plus 5%, and that might be a very poor user experience today too. For example, if I want to set up a merchant to accept payments in their shop, and I expect that they receive, let's say, 500 euros worth of payments over this month, then I will need to today set them up with the wallet by sending them a 500 euro payment, receiving that money out again to get them started with an empty channel. So maybe in the future we'll still have defaults, but we can mess with these defaults. For example, if I'm a merchant and I want to download a wallet like Breeze or Phoenix, then I can say I would like to have as extra income capacity. I need 1,000 euros of incoming capacity, even if my first payment is only 2 euros. And then maybe my fee is much higher. Maybe my fee now for the 1,000 euros of incoming capacity is a 10 euro fee. But at least you can kind of predefine your capacity. And similar with Taro, then I would expect that. So you have the on-chain component. You don't know how high that is going to be in the future, and then you have the capital cost component, which currently is quite significant for Bitcoin. I said this before. I expect it to be very, very low for stable coins, but I still believe it is going to be there. One question I have for the design community, it's an open question. It's not really a good answer, but how do we communicate these things when Lightning moves from being purely a Bitcoin network to a multi-asset network? Do you still pay with Bitcoin? Do you now pay with Lightning? Is somebody accepting Lightning payments somebody who also accepts Bitcoin payments? Especially if, let's assume, stablecoins are hugely successful and Bitcoin is not, that people might not even know that they're using Bitcoin, or they might not know that they are able to interact with somebody who pays with Bitcoin. So how do we now connect merchants who want to just accept money with users who want to spend Bitcoin? Especially if you don't think of something like Strike or Cash App, where you could theoretically also quickly run into the situations that somebody who, if there's 80 million Cash App users, how do you now tell them that they can pay anywhere they see a Bitcoin Lightning logo without confusing them of like dealing with a different currency now?
Yeah, this is exactly why I wanted to start this Taro project during the designathon, to exactly do these types of exploration on the user level, figure out if I create one of these assets, what options do I have the first time I receive something, when I set up my wallet. Also things around, you mentioned that anyone can create their own stable coin. Like, well, how as a user, how can I trust that? How can I verify that this is like some legit thing? Because the on-chain transaction may have cost like 50 cents, and it's just someone just made that up. So there needs to be some backing. How do we communicate that? How do we keep users in control? Those are exactly the type of things that I hope with this designathon that we can start investigating, and then hopefully over time we can also add these things to the design guide. Yeah. As far as Bitcoin and Lightning, we've been trying to basically hide Lightning altogether, so people just have one balance, especially for the daily spending wallet, where on-chain it doesn't really work very well. It just takes too long and too expensive. So we've been trying to see how far we can push, basically just making Lightning totally invisible altogether for the users. And I was wondering about that too. Can we also make Taro then invisible altogether?
Yeah. I'm very curious how this develops, because we today we still largely use like things like stickers on restaurants or supermarkets to signal how we can pay there. And I think for Bitcoin, Lightning, that is entirely not worked out, and Taro makes this a lot more complicated. So how do you abstract that away to find like some easy common denominator that makes it easy for me to know, oh, I can use my sats there, but also somebody who has Taro assets in their wallet should also get the same signal of, hey, your money is accepted here.
Yeah, we have the unified QR code idea, where you have on-chain address and Lightning address. Maybe we need to unify even further and add Taro information on there too.
Yeah,
but then it gets a bit complex.
Ideally, a Lightning invoice should be payable by a Taro wallet. So what's missing is that now somebody who has USD in their wallet needs to know that they can also pay at the store that says Lightning accepted.
Yeah. I mean, some of it is also will be. I was just going to say some of it is also up to how well this whole ecosystem can establish and adopt new standards.
Yeah.
And with Taproot, that seems like it's taken its time. With some other things, also even simple things like multi-language recovery phrases are just not are barely supported at all.
Yeah.
So I think, and I hope the design community can help with that a little bit, just kind of create awareness of standards and getting them into everything, because then we'll just make progress faster.
Yeah. It's also not clear who is really going to be the majority user in these cases. Is this going to be, is the Bitcoin Lightning Network going to spread so rapidly that non-Bitcoin users want to latch onto it with their stable coins? Or is this or does the Bitcoin routing aspect exist largely in the background and only purists and technologists will use it bare bones?
Yeah, I guess we'll find out, right?
Yeah, we'll find out. Yeah, very awesome that you're like tackling these questions. They're not easy.
Are you also internally at Lightning Labs, are you also doing a lot of these kind of UI explorations and kind of, I don't know, simulating potential outcomes and whatnot?
I'm definitely involved in some of these UI questions, but I'm not exactly taking the lead on where these things are going. I'm more using everything and providing detailed feedback and beta testing everything.
Gotcha. I have one more question around universes. So it's a bit of an abstract thing. Can I imagine at some point a universe be like, ChristopHBananaToken.com, and then we'll have all the information about, I created it, how many there are, who owns it, or I don't know, price or something like that. Can we essentially imagine it as a website that also has an API that wallets get whatever information they need from, or is it something that only lives, I don't know, in a Lightning gossip layer, or I don't know, I'm making it up somewhere else?
So I think most importantly, a universe will be available for the wallets to exchange this kind of proofs. I think a universe will also be very important to backup proofs, to kind of give your backup mechanism might be tied to your universe. In that, if you have a wallet and you want to back everything up, you might be very happy to have the ability to kind of back up all your proofs in a universe or two universes. How the universe then surfaces this information to let's say observers. So it's kind of like the website comes second. You would still be probably quite happy to surface a lot of this information. I think most importantly, you would want to surface what social conventions map to which cryptographic kind of assets, right? If I want to buy Leo coin, I want to buy Tether, then that's not enough for me to transact. I need to then I need to know what their genesis points are, because that's how assets are defined. They're defined similar to how you can define the Bitcoin blockchain by its consensus code plus the genesis hash. But if you start with a new genesis block, then you have even though you have the same consensus rules, you're still going to end up with a different blockchain. And so in Taro too, everybody kind of needs to discover the genesis output of the asset that they want. Mm-hmm. And universes are probably going to play a big role in just mapping that to the social conventions of what you and I call LUSD or Tether.
Yeah. Okay, so but it is essentially a server that sits somewhere.
Yeah.
That carries all that information. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't believe there will be much of a gossip layer, simply because nobody wants to create another gossip protocol, and also these. Stablecoins are always going to be a little bit centralized. There's always going to be at least a gravitational pull towards the issuer and just defining what is it called and how many are there and what are the rules. So there also isn't as much of a need to have now a purely decentralized gossip network, especially given these gossip networks can be relatively faulty and expensive.
You just said something about rules. Is it possible to create assets with different rules? Like I create my Christoph Banana token, whenever someone else sends it, I want 5% back because I'm just greedy like that.
Yeah, so I think by default, Taro rules inherit the Bitcoin rules. but because Taro doesn't require soft forks, it just requires every token can theoretically have its own rules. So as long as the clients kind of understand this, so there might be the standard Taro rules that all the clients kind of abide by. But if you want to propose a new rule for your popular stablecoin, then that is going to be far easier for you to push into the client or into some kind of client add-on. So you can have theoretically relatively complex rules. That is something that others have worked on a lot more, that also others have kind of envisioned a lot more. This kind of client-side smart contract validation, that's really a strength of others. Theoretically, it could be built into Taro that you have. For example, let's envision something very useful. Then we have like a visionary. Then we have like zero knowledge proofs in Taro, right? And then we transact Taro in a similar way that we would transact like Zcash, or we would transact Taro in a similar way that we would transact Grin or something. So relatively visionary and cryptographically complicated innovations that you could roll into Taro on a token by token basis, because now the additional computational overhead to verify a lot of this is pushed to the client, which is fine, right? It's no longer a burden to the blockchain, no longer a burden to users who don't want to interact with it. And the proofs too. You can, right? Maybe there will be some kind of transaction cost, simply because the universe, if it has to deal with gigabytes and gigabytes of zero knowledge proofs, will be overwhelmed. But all we need the blockchain for is the double spend protection. And there's also lots of fancy ideas on. So now, before I talked about the risk of a pocket universe to censor you. Now, what if you can force close something like this, right? What if you always have a commitment transaction that allows you to exit such an agreement? Then suddenly that's theoretically possible too. Then that's suddenly no longer a custodial relationship in the same way. Like a proof of censorship, or
it's super interesting. Ed, I don't know if you're looking at the time. We're like an hour 20 now. I don't know, Leo, if you're getting tired of the topic now. But, how are you two feeling?
Continue another 7 minutes to round it to the 1.5 hours.
Cool. Yeah, let's do it.
So if anyone has more questions.
Yeah, any more questions from the audience, feel free to shout them out. I guess one thing which I'm trying to sort of get my head around is just the sort of standardization of liquidity between, or sort of fungibility between different wallets and applications. And as Christoph said, maybe he creates Christoph's banana coin, and that lives, and maybe he has a self-hosted wallet or something, and it's easier for him to do that. But how do I know necessarily that my wallet is going to be able to support that or not support that? Do you see that as something which will become, there'll be sort of an industry standard, a little bit like we have, wallets now that are sort of on-chain only, wallets that are Lightning only. How do you see that kind of playing out? Because I think that's probably going to be a huge part of the accessibility of the use of these assets.
Yeah, so I think Taro is the industry standard, or is going to become the industry standard, simply as a way of defining how assets are held, transacted, which exact assets are then supported is a mix of like market-driven dynamics and social conventions. So these social conventions, I don't think there will be like a regulatory body. I think it will just be a social convention kind of driven by the exchanges and driven by the big liquidity operators to say, we now consider these assets to be the defaults, or we consider these assets to be like, this is what we consider Tether to be, and this is what we consider Circle USD to be, right? Very easy to imagine. It's now driven by these issuers. There might be some like name clashes, in which case the exchanges kind of resolve and say, oh, we have here the, what's a good example? We have here the Americoin, and we think Americoin is a trademark held by this and this group, rather than the other group, which holds the same trademark somewhere else. And that will kind of trickle into the wallets. So you will have these wallets kind of enabled by default. But I also believe that because it is going to be relatively easy to add new tokens to your stack, as long as you've implemented any kind of Taro asset, then adding a new token is relatively easy. So I do believe these wallets will allow you to kind of go into advanced settings and add the Genesis transaction of a new token to make it relatively easy for new smaller tokens to get listed or to get included. And I think that it will be a lot more bottom up eventually. In the beginning, you will have the dominant issuers issuing on Taro. That's just my belief, that's my expectation, and they will be relatively successful because they have been successful before. But for the industry and for the ecosystem to be really successful in the long run, there needs to be an easy barrier to entry into the market. And so that is relatively easily fulfilled through the Taro client. It's almost too easy to mint your own asset. Join on Friday, you'll make your own. Maybe if you have a day ready, get a testnet node started. I run mine on a $7 per month VPS. You only need to run it for a week, right? So it's relatively low cost. Then second, you need to get that stablecoin into wallets. I think also this can be relatively easy, as long as wallets kind of provide you with the functionality of add your own. And all you need to do is add the information, the core information about an asset. If you don't get it from a universe, then you will get it from just by copy pasting the minting transaction. And then from then on, you will be able to use your regular wallet to issue invoices in that, denominated in that asset. So then you can receive and then you can send. And ideally, the tooling of being an edge node is also easily accessible, that I would want everybody who's currently a kind of these currency exchange booths, everybody who runs one of these should also be capable of running a edge node, just from a business and technical perspective. There's not really much more you should need to have than a little computer in the corner and basic knowledge of FX markets. So from there, these stablecoins can then trickle into the edge nodes, and from these edge nodes, they can trickle into the exchanges by simply demand of hedging liquidity, and that includes futures exchanges, that includes spot exchanges. So that's how I kind of believe that future to look like. A very contestable market for what is essentially money certificates.
Right. Okay. So yeah, it seems like one of the most important relationships is probably going to be between the edge nodes and the rest of the network, and how they actually sort of funnel assets through the rest of it, through sort of access. We have a quick question from Saunter. Maybe go on to finish.
RGB. So I do think they can very much coexist. I don't really think Taro is like meant to be an RGB killer. It functions also differently enough that I don't think it can be considered a clone or a copy. What it does in a similar way is that both are Taproot native protocols. And so, yes, on the surface, they might at some point look a bit similar. They're both client-side validated, but RGB is trying to do a lot more. And RGB is probably going to be a lot more attractive for those building more complex smart contracts than Taro is. But if you can if you can use RGB over Lightning, then you should also be able to pay somebody who wants to accept Taro in RGB. So of course, for these protocols, these protocols have significant network effects. I think if these protocols are successful, the stable coins no longer have these massive network effects, but the protocol still will. But that doesn't at all imply that there is no room for 2 or 3 such protocols. And so in terms of operability, you're probably not going to be able to take your Taro asset and move it into an RGB wallet. But ideally, you will be able to use your RGB wallet to pay a Lightning invoice that on the other end pays somebody a Taro asset. And I don't have any questions or comments on, no comments on like any big stablecoin issuers going to launch on Taro. I think the existing alpha is also a bit too early to think about like a mainnet launch. And then who's going to be first? I don't know.
I will be first. Christoph's banana token will be the stablecoin.
Great. Yeah, I'll send you a Taro address.
Cool. Okay. Well, we just hit the 1.5 hour mark, so maybe that's a good time to leave it off. But Leo, thank you so much for coming on and talking a bit more about Taro. There's still so much more to unpack. It's actually like it's just a really big topic, and I think it will take a while to kind of let it all settle in. If I have 101 questions tomorrow morning, where do I send them?
I think the Slack, the Lightning community Slack, is a very good place. So if you go to lightning.engineering, you will find a link at the bottom to the Slack. And there is a channel in there, Taro. You can ask all your technical and non-technical questions in there. If it's short and concise, you can also ask on Twitter. So at Lightning or at LeoAW. Or find us at the many community events that are still going to happen this year.
Cool. Fantastic. Well, hopefully we'll see you again on Thursday, Leo, for a little bit more of a sort of informal discussion on tokens on Bitcoin. I'm sure it'll probably be a little bit more high-level abstract stuff. And then looking forward to seeing your colleague Hannah as well on Friday for a lot more of a technical deep dive. So if there are any developers who are watching this and you're interested in playing around with some of this code, then join us on Friday. Set up your testnet wallet so you're ready to go, and you can kind of follow along there. And yeah, looking forward to seeing some Christoph banana tokens and whatever else is there to come. Leo coin as well. Sounds kind of cool. But yeah, until then, we'll see you next time.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you all for your questions.
Thanks, guys.